This time we have the great honor of having David L. Bahnsen with us. David is, of course, the son of Greg Bahnsen. Now, David's an investment management consultant, and he's held numerous financial designations and licenses. He's the active board member of the Lincoln Club of Orange County and serves on the executive committee and chairs of the Platinum Circle. He's the vice president on the board of trustees of Pacifica Christian High School in Orange County. Mr. Bahnsen also serves on the Blackstone faculty of the Alliance Defense Fund and is a cooperating board member of the Center for Cultural Leadership, where he is the senior fellow of economics and finance. He's a lover of Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan, a National Review kind of conservative. David's hobbies include travel, fine dining, golf, and sports. His true passions include anything involving USC football, the financial markets, politics, and Palm Desert. His ultimate passions are his lovely wife of nearly 14 years, Jolene, their gorgeous and brilliant sons, Mitchell and Graham, and daughter Sadie, and the life they've created together in Newport Beach, California. Please welcome with me David L. Bahnsen.
Thank you for that, Chris. I appreciate it very much, and it's an honor to be here with you. I'm going to start my little goodie here. All right, well, I've been looking forward to this for some time. I sure appreciate the invitation. It's a blessing to be here today to address you all. Particularly fun for me to be doing this in the great city of Torrance, where I was born about 41 and a half years ago. Both myself and my kid brother were born right here at Torrance Memorial in 1974 and 75, respectively. When my parents lived in Manhattan Beach, my dad was pursuing his doctoral studies at the world's greatest university, USC, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from here, though there was no carpool lane on the 110 freeway in 1974. It's a pleasure to be in Torrance and an honor to be speaking to you all today about the life of Greg Bahnsen, my late father and my hero. When Chris first asked me to speak at this event, which coincides with the 20th anniversary of my dad's passing, I wondered how I may present something that would be of interest to the audience, who I presume would be folks already familiar with my dad, his life, and certainly his teaching. My reflections quickly caused me to realize that I was really wrong about at least half of that. A 2015 audience that sees fit to congregate to reflect on the teachings of Greg Bahnsen and his impact in matters of theology and apologetics may very well have familiarity with his teaching, but with a few exceptions, some of you here today, very few, familiarity with his actual life is not something many would possess. Perhaps some of you have read a few tidbits over the years. Others may have read the biography in the Festschrift or even a Wikipedia page, but it occurred to me that if the audience were to hear something today from me that represented new material, it would likely be in the realm of his personal life, his personality, his character, the Greg Bahnsen that his friends and family knew. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy to talk about his prowess as a thought leader and public intellectual, as he had few peers in his ability to do theology and to dissect epistemology. I do not minimize any part of what he taught people over the years in the fields of theology, philosophy, apologetics, ethics, or any of the other disciplines that he was indisputably and particularly gifted in. But to maximize the effectiveness of my talk and its fruitfulness for you, I'm going to primarily focus on three categories of Greg Bahnsen's life and the impact it had on me that I will suggest far transcend his contribution to various academic and scholarly disciplines. Those three are Greg Bahnsen, the pastor, Greg Bahnsen, the person, and Greg Bahnsen, the Kuyperian. I suppose a fair amount may have been written about Greg Bahnsen, the pastor, and the Covenant Media Foundation's been making his sermons available for over 2 decades. I often think it's a shame, not that the atheist debates and the more high-profile topical lectures generate so much interest, but that the Galatians and Luke and especially Proverbs series have not generated more. I've sat under a lot of pastors and heard the preaching of a lot of preachers over the years. I'm telling you that if you were to know Greg Bahnsen, the teacher, and Greg Bahnsen, the lecturer, but you do not know Greg Bahnsen, the preacher, you are missing out. My dad achieved his THM and his MDiv simultaneously at Westminster Seminary because he wanted to be both a teacher and a pastor. The 2 degrees mirrored the 2 callings he felt he had. He is not the first scholar, especially in the world of Reformed theology, to have juxtaposed a career as a professor scholar with a career as a shepherd minister. But I will suggest to you he did both at a higher caliber than most who have tried. He wasn't an outstanding scholar who preached mediocre sermons. He was an outstanding scholar who preached outstanding sermons. One of my best friends lives in Connecticut, and he and I asked a pastor friend of ours on the East Coast once what he thought about the preaching of another pastor that we were curious about for a number of reasons with a church plant. He replied that his preaching was a little weak, but that he was a great pastor. And my Connecticut friend replied, "Isn't that like someone being slow but still a great runner because they're good at stretching?" A good pastor is a good preacher. Mediocre preaching is not more acceptable when the pastor has a more impressive reading list, and certainly not when they're skilled at running a session meeting, who after all wants to be good at that. My dad believed that preaching mattered, and he prepared for his sermons with passion and energy. I will be very honest with you because you don't know this about him the way I do. But if my dad did not open his Bible, open a commentary, prepare an outline, or so much as jot a note down, and he walked up to a pulpit like a stand-up comic on improv night, he would have delivered a sermon that would have blown you away. He just had that skill, quick on his feet, unprecedented command of the material, especially when that material was the Word of God, and great oratory confidence. But he didn't approach the pulpit with that kind of self-assurance and nonchalance. He poured himself into preparation, and he had real God-given talent as a preacher. I am not one to critique a preacher around subjective style preferences. I accept that different preachers have different styles and different congregants have different preferences. I could name many different preachers that I would all classify as excellent, despite them each having totally different styles from one another. Some of you may have liked his style as a preacher, and some may not have, but within his style and method of delivery, he was truly gifted. He was expositional, but still topical. He was passionate, but still sober. He was eloquent and still convicting. But just as much as I believe a good pastor will be a good preacher, I do not believe that a good preacher is necessarily going to be a good pastor. Greg Bahnsen came from this ancient period of American history where not every pastor was tasked with becoming a celebrity. He held to this prehistoric view that a pastor was a shepherd and was to be engaged in the life of his congregation. This approach likely does doom one to a low ceiling these days in terms of church growth. But I will tell you that in the heyday of Covenant Community Church, let's call it 1985 to 1989, sound about right, Jim? There was a really tight congregation that was shepherded and fed. And I think of those years fondly. All right, I made it through that paragraph. I can get through the rest really easily. My dad was a Presbyterian minister, and his ordination and lifetime pastoral ministry resided in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I'm not going to use my speech to posit my own views on church government or any particular denomination or tradition. You all want to hear about Greg Bahnsen, not what David Bahnsen thinks. But what I will say is that for right or for wrong, Greg Bahnsen was loyal to his Presbyterian belief system, and he died still in a very traditional fidelity to what many have believed for generations it means to be a Presbyterian. He was a loyal churchman, whatever that means, and I can tell you that personal sacrifice and suffering did not get in the way of that. A great preacher, a real Presbyterian churchman, and a true shepherd. I will not delve too deeply today into the details of the marital counseling he did over the years that absolutely transformed and sometimes preserved or restored marriages. But he did this because he viewed it as his calling to care for the folks he was responsible for in terms of spiritual oversight. It was not formula-driven counseling or stoic lecturing. It was a matter of personal investment for him. You don't get to know about the impact he had on personal lives as a shepherd by merely reading his Van Til book, as masterful as the book was. What I want people to know today about Greg Bahnsen It said, he grieved when his congregation grieved, and he rejoiced when they rejoiced. He wanted his congregation to flourish. It's one of the great memories I have of my dad, the pastor. I went through a phase after his 1995 passing where I felt bad for him for ever getting sucked into the ministry. I knew it had taken its toll on him emotionally, and he did fight various denominational battles his entire life. He endured a painful church split a few years before he died, and he didn't necessarily get to enjoy respite as an overseer of a church. I felt for a period of time after he died that had he just skipped that portion of his adult life, he would have found greater peace and happiness, and still great fulfillment and calling exclusively as a thought leader. But that phase of resentment didn't last long. I may wish certain parts of his ecclesiastical life had gone differently, but I know that God wanted Greg Bahnsen to be a shepherd, and he used him tremendously in that calling. My comments about Greg Bahnsen, the person, Greg Bahnsen as a friend and, of course, a father, are meant to be the core of my talk today, and I'll do my best to move at an efficient pace. But I want to offer a little caveat before I dig deeply into this. If anyone either listening today or hearing or reading this speech later was hoping for a little dirt, a little info in the skeletons in the closet, so to speak, they're probably going to be disappointed. For one thing, if I sat down one-on-one with my closest friends in the world and shared every nook and cranny of my family history with them, which I've done many times, it would not be very exciting. It would not be TMZ worthy whatsoever. Greg Bahnsen didn't have big secrets, and I don't have big dirt to share. He was not a perfect person, and I'm going to just sort of take for granted that everybody knew that. He had faults and shortcomings like everyone in the room does, and that's about the most you're going to get out of me on that. I've read Chris Buckley's posthumous treatment of his father, the incomparable William F. Buckley, and I've read the unforgivable material on Francis Schaeffer penned by the contemptible Frankie Schaeffer. I hold my dad in tremendous regard. I spent 20 years honoring his legacy, and I'm going to talk more of what that means in a moment. I do not lionize him or deify him. I knew him probably better than anyone in the room or anyone who will ever read or hear this speech. So yes, I'm perfectly comfortable saying he had faults, but beyond that, it strikes me as perfectly unnecessary to say anymore. I really believe a lot of the people who most appreciate Greg Bahnsen's teaching ministry and scholarly abilities would be really disappointed to understand what actually drove him sociologically. Let's just say he held strongly to the theological tenets of today's Reformed theology, but very few of the sociological tenets. This is particularly true of Greg Bahnsen compared to the sociological tenets of what many have called Reconstructionism over the years. He possessed an intense approach to his work. He was rigorous, disciplined, and basically obsessive, though I mean that as a total compliment, believe me. However, his off time was not filled with a Van Til book or a long conversation about the Pentateuch. He read Tom Clancy novels, he listened to rock and roll like it was going out of business, and he enjoyed food as much as anyone you will ever meet in your life. He loved Southern California, both the LA County he grew up in and the Orange County he lived in as an adult, besides 3 forgettable years in Jackson, Mississippi. That LA County, Orange County shared life is why I forgive him for being both a Dodger fan and an Angel fan, something no one else in the world is allowed to be as far as I'm concerned, as an Angel fan. If you ever drove with him, you know that he did not seem to be very constrained by speed limit laws. So when some rather kooky people have come to me over the years planning an overthrow of the government or some such nonsense and looking for a Greg Bahnsen stamped approval of their insanity, I've always had to say, sorry, but unless you're talking about speed limit laws, you wouldn't have my dad on your side. This is actually more than a merely anecdotal subject in Dad's life, the fringe stuff, not his love of driving fast. My dad was in a world that had a lot of fringe components to it, but he wasn't a fringe kind of guy, if you follow me. He was so respected as a theologian and found himself in such an odd world at times that people loved to come to him for support on their various tax protest or underground currency movements. They literally just could not believe his response when he shot them down with utter conviction and sobriety. I spent years reading every single letter, every piece of paper, every file in my dad's vast personal correspondence library. His patient but cool and uncompromised rejection of this kind of stuff was utterly inspiring. I really do not know how he had the patience for a lot of this. He was perhaps more patient than people give him credit for. But he didn't suffer a fool easily. He had theological beliefs, he had friends, he had family, but he did not have a movement personality. It just wasn't his shtick, thank God. When I talk about those files I spent so much time and effort devouring, there is something I want to mention to you all that has stuck with me for most of the time he's been gone. Greg Bahnsen was a person who had very, very few enemies in the unsaved world. The correspondence between Dad and Gordon Stein may have been an exception, but the treatment he received from scores and scores of ideological opponents on the other side of the antithesis was nearly always filled with respect, collegiality, and poise. Frankly, the vast majority of correspondence I read of his with non-Reformed Christians was often the same, even if the subject of the correspondence was disagreement over a matter of ideology. Always a tone of respect and collegiality and warmth. The ugly stuff was always from those who were closer and closer to his various distinctives, and I can't explain this to you. I couldn't if I tried. No one's ever explained it to me. But when I talk about the way Dallas Willard and Richard Mouw and Father Richard John Newhouse and others interacted with him, not necessarily close to his distinctive circles, not to mention dozens of unsaved intellectuals, it was like a different world when you start reading the correspondence of people sometimes in his own camp. I take that at the very least as a testimony to his scholarly caliber and his reputation and his own respectful demeanor. He spent most of his adult life with the woman he married and had his kids with, having met her in high school, married her in college, and had kids with her throughout the grad school years, me being one of them. 20 years nearly to the day after they were married, she left him and his kids, yours truly included, and that was the end of that. And it's not a fact of his life that warrants a ton of mention today. It's public knowledge. It's been written about plenty, but it was a defining and tragic part of Dad's adult life. I talked earlier about my wondering if he really needed that pastor side of his vocational life, which often caused him a lot of emotional angst. But I will certainly say that I've spent even many more years wondering why he loved her as much as he did, why he just really never did stop loving her, even to his dying day. I mention it to you today, the bulk of which perhaps don't even know what I'm talking about. Not to tee up me having the chance to express my own feelings on the matter, because I'm not going to do that either, but rather because I think it speaks to something profound about Greg Bahnsen's character and nature. He was a forbearing husband, more forbearing than you would want to imagine. And while obviously not a perfect one, he had a threshold for pain in a relationship that exceeds what mere mortals should ever have to endure. He was a special kind of father. He turned me on to C.S. Lewis at a young age, and I've really never looked back. From very, very early memories of him reading C.S. Lewis to us, to slightly later memories of him making us read C.S. Lewis to him, he transferred everything about himself into us in profound and memorable ways. I actually shudder to think what his productivity would have looked like had he actually worked and lived in an age of email, let alone the internet, let alone portable devices, social media, etc. His ability in the modern age to create content and to distribute said content would have been simply unfathomable. Think about what I just said. He died in 1995, the year Netscape introduced a web browser. He never owned a computer with Windows. He never accessed a website. He never shopped online, read online, or studied online. He never even owned a laser printer. In just 20 years, the world has changed that much. You would only be human to wonder why God took him before his scholarly abilities could have met Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Greg Bahnsen didn't sleep a lot, but he did like his Sunday afternoon naps. Does that make someone a Sabbatarian? I've told this story before about waking up at 6 a.m. after I got out of high school, ready to beat him to my day's tasks at hand, only to find him in his study working. And so I decided I would beat him the next day. So I tried 5:30, the same outcome. So now bordering on misery, I pushed it to 5 a.m., and the same result awaited me And so finally I just went for broke, and I got up at 4 a.m. to win this little contest, deciding he would find me in his office working. But when I walked in at 4 a.m., I found him sitting there typing. I just gave up and conceded defeat, except for he didn't know we were in a contest. Well, I'm now an obsessive 4 a.m. start guy, and I blame him entirely. But truthfully, I don't actually know what time he really got up. He will always have me beat for this reason, if none other. I've had an entire cup of coffee by 4:10 a.m. every day and another one by 4:30 a.m., but he never drank coffee, ever. It's utterly unfathomable to me. He hated mushrooms. He loved Chinese food. He loved going to movies, even by himself, sometimes especially by himself. And his love of rock and roll is well documented. I'm not sure what evoked a stronger reaction, his love of regular rock music, or his utter contempt for Christian music. He was no subculturist. He hated Christian music. And he could pick it out when he heard it after 5 seconds. He loved taking friends and family who were visiting Orange County to a jazz or a blues band at one of his favorite night spots in Laguna or Newport Beach. And did I mention that he liked driving fast? These things often all went together. He didn't drink much alcohol, a beer here, a glass of wine there, even that not very often. It just kind of wasn't his thing. He didn't do well with his mind numbed. We didn't do well with his mind numbed either. He didn't need his mind numbed. In the last few years of his life, he had really forged some close friendships around the country. His teaching ministry was at a strong place of impact. I've heard from more people about the impact the Bahnsen-Stein debate had on them than any other part of his recorded legacy. His scholarly contributions to apologetics are by far his most important, and it's in the area of presuppositionalism, his commitment to a thoroughly biblical apologetic, his proficiency as a Christian philosopher, that I most earnestly hope his legacy will be remembered, a legacy that in those last few years of his life he really got to build on and grow with. Do you ever wonder why the great wave of popular new atheism led by the Hitchens, Dawkins, Harris cabal came after Dad died? And those debates were never able to happen, meaning debates with one of those guys with Bahnsen? I do. I wonder all the time. God's ways are not mine, and his ways are perfect. But oh, how I longed for my dad to be around during 2005 to 2010 when those debates were active. That conversation was on a national stage, and I don't think we got our best representation. The fruit hung lowest, but Dad was gone. I said my third category of discussion in the speech would be Greg Bahnsen, the Kuyperian, and this may be a tad unexpected, because I believe most people think of him as an heir of Calvin or Van Til and even John Murray, one of his favorite theologians, all of which are very, very true. He loved all three of those men, was a proficient scholar in their work, and he left behind, I believe, the seminal work on Van Til and truly remarkable work in the study of John Calvin. He was a Calvinist, he was a Van Tilian, but I'm highlighting his Kuyperianism today for the simple reason that everyone already knows of Bahnsen as a Calvinist and presuppositionalist, but he's not often described as a Kuyperian. That ought to change. Because if there was ever a guy who thought he was going to be some form of a Christian scholar, it was me. Whether it was in a preaching capacity or teaching capacity, I studied theology obsessively for years and just always sort of figured my calling and greatest utility, but it would be in some form of my father's footsteps. But my plans had not yet encountered the depths of my dad's Kuyperianism, and it had not encountered the rigors of his hostility to dualism. If you ever wanted to bring your rationale to my dad for why you should quit your job and enter the ministry, you had better have been prepared to have that secular sacred distinction ripped to pieces right before your eyes and dropped on your feet. All my father ever wanted for me was to have a fulfilling life, and he would have been perfectly happy no matter how that manifested itself. But he didn't merely not pressure me to follow in his footsteps. He truly discouraged it. In this regard, I owe him the biggest favor of all, for he blessed me in finding a path where I could maximize my own kingdom usefulness. And he did this with total intentionality, total awareness, total purpose. He knew that God had plans for me, and he knew that I was prone to manipulate myself into thinking it needed to be something it didn't need to be. He cut this off at the pass. And the fruits of what he did in this regard at the last year of his life have been coming off of that tree ever since. This is not a blessing because of material prosperity or the fact that I don't have to go to Presbyterian meetings, though I wouldn't complain about either of those things. It's a blessing because it helped to define identity and purpose and meaning in my life and serves, in my opinion, as a tremendous lesson for so many others struggling to find their purpose, meaning, and identity. People who take theology seriously, but need to know how important it is to be in the universe business. Greg Bahnsen believed that God was in all of the universe, that God wanted the whole culture, not a substitute culture, and that the need of the hour was not more people talking about Christian dominion, but rather people doing it. I think about that aspect of my dad almost every single day. He knew, as the great Kuyper did, that Christ had laid claim to all, and he wanted us to start acting like it. If you hear anything out of my speech today about Greg Bahnsen, hear this. Sounds like a good water break. This was a man who could have done absolutely anything he wanted to in his life. He was just one of those people. I've met a couple others like that too, and they always provoke the same sort of head-shaking awe. It's just a superhuman level of skill and discipline and drive that warrants one being described in this way. Obviously, it is a non-falsifiable statement. He didn't become a lawyer or a software engineer, so no one can prove that he couldn't have excelled in those fields. So I'm safe. But I'm telling you, there isn't an ounce of doubt in my body that he could have called his number in life. He had the sort of determination and resolve that is nearly pathological, and yet he applied his rigor without a dysfunctional pathology, but actually a real special balance and normalcy. It was a blessing that I can never repay to have grown up observing. I have often said over the years that there is nothing about me that I like that I did not get from my dad. I still believe that to this day. I suppose I may have gotten a few things from him I don't like, and I certainly have other things about me that I do not like, of which I can't give him any of the blame. But the things about me, whatever they may be worth liking, are things I got from Greg Bahnsen, period. I've grown a lot in the last 20 years that he has been gone, and I'm very comfortable thinking about and talking about his strengths, weaknesses, good habits, bad habits. Greg Bahnsen was a human being, but boy, did he hate people using that as an excuse for abject moral failure. Aren't you all getting sick of hearing it too? Boy, did he hate people using that as an excuse for mediocrity. Whatever it was that drove Greg Bahnsen, we all should want more of that. If our society could somehow get a decade of his views on antithesis stamped across its forehead, or instead, a decade of his influence as a person, pastor, and Kuyperian, I will tell you that it's the latter which would have the greatest kingdom impact. Of course, I'd be happy to take both. Thank you again for the privilege of today's invitation. If time permits, I think we've left plenty for Q&A. Thanks very much for letting me get through this. Someone in the back, Chris.
What were your dad's family devotions, if any? What did they look like with the family?
There's kind of two tiers to that, because there was the family devotions that he did with our whole family, and it kind of took different shapes and sizes over the years around school schedules and things like that. Where at a very young age, we went through the catechism. We did a lot more when I was real young at nighttime than in the morning. And I do remember, that's I alluded in the speech to his fondness for C.S. Lewis, and we went through a lot of C.S. Lewis stuff together. But as far as devotion, he was an incredible prayer and an incredible Bible reader. And after he died, I got his Bible, and to see the level of notes and writing as he would go through the Psalms and the Proverbs, It was unbelievable. And so I thought, basically it almost was like scribbled up, the passages throughout Proverbs. And I thought, well, he did a whole sermon exposition from Proverbs. So probably I'm getting all the notes from that sermon series, which I want to say was probably 1986 or so, the Proverbs series. The problem was that the Bible had been bought in 1994. So he had a lot of notes on the Proverbs just in the last, let's call it 18 months of his life. So he held very firmly to that personal devotional side, yeah.
David?
Yes.
As your father wrote
Oh, hey, Tim.
great books, by this standard, no other standard, did he talk to you? As your father wrote his great books, like By This Standard, did he talk to you how he envisioned having the teachings in those books embedded into culture so that we might enjoy again something like Calvin's Geneva or Kuyper's Amsterdam?
Yeah, the answer to him is yes, but maybe in a little different of a context. So there's kind of a different timeline than maybe you're envisioning. He wrote By This Standard initially much earlier than it came out, and it was kind of reworked and ended up being published a bit later. And I want to say by the time By This Standard was actually published, it was 1985 and had been written before that, and was largely kind of taken from another book that he had been commissioned to write earlier that never came out. So, at that point I was very young in the 70s, and then No Other Standard came out later, and it was a response to different critics, and by then he and I were talking like every single night about all this stuff. So those two books weren't necessarily the catalyst to a lot of those conversations, but throughout the 90s, so from the time my mom left in 1989, I graduated high school in 92, and he died in 95. So you had kind of a 3-year period where I was there with him without, his wife and everything, and I was still in high school, and we spoke about these kind of things a lot. And then I graduated high school, and we had a little time before he died, and then and he was traveling a lot and speaking and lecturing. And I think his vision for how these things may have been formulated in society was really evolving and coming to. I don't believe that the blueprint for how it would come together was ever finalized. If it had been, I think it would have been amended a lot over the years. But I do think he saw himself as being someone to do a lot of foundational work, and that a lot of the tactics and things were necessarily going to have to come later, which is maybe unfortunate. Now, I get to do, there's a whole kind of cottage industry of people that tell me a lot what Greg Bahnsen would have thought about a certain thing, and so it's not, I don't pay a lot of heed anymore. It used to bother me a little. It doesn't now, but I get to do the same thing. I just figure if anyone has a right to, maybe it's me. But I at least admit I don't really know. I don't know how he would have evolved post-1995 and how a lot of these things, worldview-wise, he would have seen transforming our culture. I know that he did not believe in the notion that the whole society would necessarily have to completely collapse before it could be rebuilt, which is not the same as saying it wouldn't collapse before it was being rebuilt, but he didn't see that as a necessary precondition, and we spoke about that at great length. And I know that he was what we used to call a gradualist, and I've used the term incrementalist. He believed a lot of these things would gradually, incrementally take hold, well, just in terms of a deeper view of Christian worldview. And I don't know what everyone in the room thinks about a lot of different things that happen right now in Christendom, but I will say that it's been very interesting to see how a lot of this has come together. I think there's a lot more talk today about a sort of a Christian world and life view than there's ever been, which is kind of ironic because we're told that everything's worse than it's ever been. But you have abject Southern Baptist, dispensationalists all over the world that are complete full-blown worldviewists, dare I say dominionist, okay? So I think that a lot of it has started to come together in ways that nobody really would have forecasted 20, 25 years ago, but I wouldn't say that means the work's done. I'm just saying things have changed so much that I just speculate how he kind of would have thought about that. So they were great kitchen conversations, kitchen table conversations back in the early 90s, but I suspect they'd be even better conversations now. I hope that's helpful, Tim. Sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, David.
Oh, he's got a mic in the back. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, David.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with the Michael Martin debate that didn't happen, but were there any other debates that Greg Bahnsen may have wanted to have?
I think you probably mean in a more formal institutional capacity, that like there was an invitation and let's do this and have an event and so forth. You know, I don't know that there was ever a debate. Mike Nelson here may be able to correct me. There was ever a debate that he solicited. I mean, the Stein debate was put together for him by someone else. The Michael Martin debate, the institution he worked for, went out and kind of put those things together, and a lot of people know what happened with Martin on that. But I don't recall my dad sending a letter to somebody saying, I want to debate you or whatever. It wasn't really his personality. From a topical standpoint, though, I think he really... See, remember, he didn't think of apologetics as an intellectual discipline. He believed it was part and parcel with evangelism. He really believed in apologetics, and the Stein debate in particular. He probably listened to the debate twice. I've probably listened to it 2,000 times, and his favorite portion was at the very end when he quoted Scripture. He didn't quote it throughout the whole night and did in the end. I think he would have probably liked to have debated some more on the atheist side. But things like that gun control debates, on the topical debates, I mean, he was good at it. I don't know that he was out chomping at the bit for it. But probably, if I were to guess, and I'm just taking a little license here because I think, I can. I think he would have preferred to debate more with unbelievers than other topical debates with other believers. That's my guess.
David, your dad, as you mentioned, studied with Dallas Willard, and I did my undergraduate work with him, but also took all the graduate seminars he offered as an undergraduate. And I just know that he had an immense influence on my life, not simply in terms of the philosophy that he taught and the intellectual discipline and so on, but also as an example of a gracious Christian scholar who got deeply involved in his students' lives. And I wondered, if you could perhaps you weren't old enough at the time to really observe that an awful lot, and I don't know how long he and Dallas maintained a lot of contact after he finished his PhD, but would you just maybe enlarge a little bit upon that particular relationship, both in terms of the personal parts of it and the intellectual legacy parts?
Yeah, now that you mentioned that you were a student of Dallas Willard's, I'm going to feel guilty sharing this part with you, but I do have framed in my office a letter Dallas sent me after Dad died saying he was the very best student that he ever had. So, no, they were very close, and Dallas, of course, just passed away a couple of years ago, as you surely know, and Dr. Willard was an unbelievable man, an incredible thinker and writer. And ironically, after my dad died is when Willard really became a big influence in my life. I read a lot of his stuff. I think he's an absolutely tremendous thinker. But they stayed in touch. Over the years, there was a lot of correspondence I alluded to in my talk, and that's an example, because I wouldn't have thought of a guy like Dallas Willard wasn't an OPC guy, Richard Mao was not an OPC guy, and I had, this thick of correspondence from these guys that was so kind and affectionate, in some cases about a disagreement, like the correspondence with Richard Mao originated with my dad correcting him on something that he thought Mao misrepresented, and Mao agreeing and apologizing and getting into that back and forth. And so there was just a lot of respect and collegiality there, to use the term I used earlier. Let's see, how old was Dallas then? He would have been well into his 80s, I believe, when he passed. So he was was obviously a lot older, but I know that he spoke publicly and privately very, very affectionately about Dad. And like I said, he reached out to me and sent a letter that I have framed in my home office. Yeah. Neat stuff. I saw another hand somewhere over here.
I really like that sentence about Christians doing dominion as opposed to just talking about it. Can you please expound on this a little bit? Give us more examples about the kinds of things that Greg Bahnsen expected people to do.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to ask what David Bahnsen expected people to do, but I'll settle for Greg Bahnsen. His thoughts on this subject basically were where mine were formed. Look, he he was just an absolute anti-dualist to the core. This idea about work being the thing you do so you can pay your bills to make it to a church on Sunday or something, it wasn't his cup of tea. He really, truly believed in the marketplace. He believed in vocation. He was a deep churchman, and he was a deep family man, very covenantal, his approach to that. But as far as the dominion question, I think that he believed something that, frankly, is rather intuitive and obvious for those of us who want to see the influence of Christ permeate our culture more, which is, it's great if there's a little bit rising tide of folks talking about it, but there needs to be a much greater rising tide of folks doing it. And so the various aspects, it's interesting because so much of the talk around the world, like his middle son, who's me, has been kind of a political junkie for years and years, but that's not anything I can really explain. That's not really an offshoot of my kingdom aspirations. I sort of just got stuck with it. It was kind of Reagan who got me into that in a real young age. I think he saw politics as a much lower element of dominion. He was politically involved. He was very politically informed. He read. You just have to trust me. He read an insane amount of material on it. He voted. But I don't think he even equated dominion with the political realm as much. I think he truly believed it would be from the transformation of people's hearts and minds, evidenced throughout growing families, growing churches, that then would transform the communities in which they lived, not go start sub-communities. And that's the big thing that I've really stuck with. It's an important point to me, is I think that so much of where there is, and it's not a lot, but where there is some ideological compatibility on the subject, the application of it has tended to go into sort of a subcultural direction, and that wasn't the way my dad saw this going. He truly believed gradualistically, incrementally, that dominion could happen within our society at large.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David L. Bahnsen.
Thank you all. Thanks.